The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. Sharon Osbourne could hear the subtle humming of the refrigerator downstairs, the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall, and the soft rustle of the wind brushing against the windows of the estate. It was late, well past midnight, but something inside her stirred. A woman's intuition, maybe. A sense she'd carried with her for years, often ignored, always suppressed. But tonight, it refused to be silenced. She had awoken in a cold sweat, alone in the guest bedroom she had retreated to during one of Ozzy's more distant phases. Their marriage had known its seasons, chaotic, tender, explosive, silent, but this moment felt different. She couldn't explain why, not then. Her heart raced as she stepped out of bed and crept barefoot through the hallway, her robe clutched tightly around her. The floor beneath her feet groaned softly with every step. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And then she saw it. Their bedroom door, slightly ajar. Light poured from within, warm and yellow, outlining the shadows on the floor. Two voices. A woman's hushed laughter and Ozzy's low murmur, intimate, comfortable, familiar in a way that twisted Sharon's stomach into knots. She pushed the door open, not fully aware of her own body moving. And there, in the bed they had once shared as husband and wife, as mother and father, as public figures bound by love and legacy, she saw them. Ozzy and the nanny, her trusted live-in support, the woman who had been welcomed into their home like family. For a moment, silence ruled. Time seemed to halt. Ozzy's eyes went wide. The nanny froze, and Sharon stood at the doorway with the kind of stillness that only deep, soul-wrenching betrayal could evoke. It wasn't the anger that came first. It was heartbreak. The kind that suffocates, not explodes. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked away, her mind spiraling through memories of trust, family, partnership, all now shattered by the scene she had just witnessed. That night changed everything. And yet, no one ever knew. Not the tabloids who pried into their marriage with speculation and scandal. Not the millions of fans who watched the Osbournes and saw a dysfunctional but loving family. Not even her children, at least, not then. Sharon Osbourne kept that secret. She buried it deep beneath the empire she helped build, under years of loyalty, pain, and fear. Now, at 72, with nothing left to lose and a voice that refuses to be quieted, Sharon has decided to speak. Not for revenge, not for sympathy, but for truth. For herself. For every woman who's ever kept a family together at the expense of her own soul. This is the story she never told. Until now. The relationship between Sharon and Ozzy Osbourne has always fascinated the public. A rock and roll marriage that defied all odds, drug addictions, near-death experiences, multiple separations, health battles, and tabloid storms. Through it all, Sharon stood by him. Many called it devotion. Others called it denial. But no one really knew what it cost her. Behind the eyeliner, the bravado, and the acerbic wit lived a woman who carried burdens too heavy to be seen. A woman who once believed that love meant sacrifice, until the weight of that sacrifice nearly consumed her. Ozzy was never an easy man. Brilliant, yes. Talented beyond comprehension. But also volatile, lost in substances, often unreachable. Sharon, by contrast, was the stabilizing force. She built his career, saved him from destruction time and time again, and raised their children while managing the chaos that came with being married to the Prince of Darkness. But even she couldn't have predicted that the deepest betrayal wouldn't come from a stranger or a groupie backstage, but from someone they had trusted with their home, their children, their peace. The nanny was young, attractive, and competent. She had been hired at a time when Sharon was dealing with both her health and Ozzy's relapses. The house was large, their schedule demanding, and Sharon, ever the pragmatic matriarch, had learned to delegate. Over time, the nanny became more than just staff. She was invited to dinner, shared holidays with the family, and was even given her own room in the West Wing. Looking back, Sharon says the signs were there. The prolonged glances between Ozzy and the nanny, the giggles behind closed doors, the excuses about late-night chores. But love has a way of blinding us to the most obvious truths. Or maybe it's not blindness at all. Maybe it's just willful ignorance born out of exhaustion. Sometimes, knowing the truth hurts more than living the lie. And so Sharon ignored the red flags. Until she couldn't anymore. What followed that night wasn't a dramatic fallout. There were no suitcases flung down staircases, no public denouncements, no police calls. Sharon didn't want the world to know. She didn't want her children to carry the shame. She didn't want the empire they had built to collapse under the weight of one disgusting, selfish act. So she did what women have been doing for centuries. She swallowed her pain, plastered on a smile, and kept the house running. But the silence came at a cost. Inside, Sharon was unraveling. Her trust in Ozzy, already fragile, was obliterated. Her sense of home was poisoned. The bed that once symbolized their love became a battlefield of broken vows. She found herself retreating emotionally, numbing the hurt with work, TV appearances, anything that distracted her from the reality she couldn't bear to face. And all the while, Ozzy remained, apologetic but detached. He blamed addiction. He said he was confused, that it meant nothing. But the damage had already been done. The rot had settled in, and no amount of therapy, time, or damage control could reverse what Sharon had seen with her own eyes. Publicly, they continued as a couple. On red carpets, they posed like any power couple. In interviews, Sharon joked about Ozzy's past and playfully scolded him about his wild behavior. But those laughs masked decades of emotional labor. They hid the truth of a woman who was suffering in silence. Many people asked why she stayed. Why would a woman of her stature, strength, and independence choose to remain with a man who had so deeply betrayed her? Sharon has since admitted the answer is complex. It wasn't just love. It was fear. Fear of breaking apart a family that had already weathered so much. Fear of the public fallout. Fear that leaving would validate every rumor, every tabloid headline that had ever called their marriage a sham. But it was also about control. Sharon had spent decades managing Ozzy's career, holding the reins of a billion-dollar brand. Walking away would have meant surrendering all of that, starting over, letting go of the things she had worked so hard to preserve. So she stayed. For a while, they separated privately more than once. There were cold silences, screaming matches behind locked doors, and long stretches where they lived like strangers. But somehow, they always ended up back together. Until Sharon reached her limit. And now, finally, she speaks. Because secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch. And Sharon knows she can't carry this one to her grave. She has lived too long in the shadows of a man's betrayal, too long in the role of protector, too long holding the burden of silence. This story is not just about Ozzy's infidelity. It's about Sharon's endurance, about the societal expectation that women must always hold the family together, no matter the personal cost. It's about what happens when that strength becomes a prison. And most of all, it's about reclaiming the narrative. She doesn't want pity. She wants truth. As she prepares to share the full scope of what happened, the emotional unraveling, the family fallout, the quiet revenge, and her path to self-recovery, Sharon invites us into a world we thought we knew but never really understood. The story begins with betrayal, but where it ends may surprise us all. Before the betrayal, before the silence, before the carefully curated smiles and interviews, there was fire. A fierce, unpredictable flame that bound two unlikely souls together. One a wild, unruly force of rock and rebellion, the other a sharp, unyielding storm of wit, strength, and resolve. Ozzy and Sharon Osbourne's love was never quiet. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't textbook. It was an explosion, messy, consuming, and intoxicating. They met in the late 1970s, during a time when both of them were struggling to find stability in a world that fed on chaos. Ozzy, freshly ousted from Black Sabbath due to his self-destructive habits and spiraling addictions, was drifting. Sharon, the daughter of legendary music manager Don Arden, was already immersed in the music industry, but her relationship with her father was strained and complex. She didn't just inherit his business acumen. She also inherited his stubbornness, his ruthless commitment to loyalty, and an unrelenting work ethic. When Sharon took over as Ozzy's manager, few believed she could revive his career. Fewer still believed she could survive him. But Sharon didn't just survive, she reshaped him. She rebuilt his name from the ashes, launching his solo career, setting him on a path of reinvention with the 1980 debut of Blizzard of Oz. She managed everything, his bookings, his finances, his public image. But more than that, She managed him. His breakdowns, his binges, his spirals. And somewhere in the midst of all that madness, they fell in love. Not the slow, candlelit kind of love, but the kind that crashes through walls and sets fires to everything it touches. They were volatile, passionate. Their fights were legendary. Their makeups, even more so. They thrived in a space between love and war, and somehow, it worked. They made sense in a way that didn't make sense to anyone else. Ozzy once said that Sharon saved his life, not just from addiction, but from obscurity. Sharon, on the other hand, claimed Ozzy gave her something no other man ever did: raw honesty. Even when it was ugly, even when it came wrapped in pain, the world watched them build a family, a brand, a legacy. Together, they navigated the brutal world of showbiz. They had 3 children: Amy, who chose to stay out of the limelight; Kelly, who embraced fame and rebellion in equal measure; and Jack, whose struggle with addiction mirrored his father's, but who ultimately found his own strength. On screen, in interviews, and through their iconic MTV reality series, The Osbournes, viewers saw the chaos. The dogs barking, the curse words flying, the arguments erupting without warning. But underneath all the spectacle, there was a connection, a visible, pulsing bond between Sharon and Ozzy. A mutual understanding that said, no matter what, we stay. They weren't just partners in life. They were partners in survival. Sharon didn't just manage his career. She managed his relapses, his hospital visits, his lawsuits, his headlines. She was there when Ozzy nearly died from a quad bike accident in 2003. She was there when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's decades later. She stood beside him on red carpets, in courtrooms, and in hotel rooms after rehab stints. Her love wasn't fragile. It was forged in fire. And for many years, Sharon believed their love could withstand anything. That belief, as it turns out, became both her armor and her downfall. Because while Sharon was holding everything together, the children, the business, the legacy, something was breaking. Ozzy's old demons never stayed buried for long. His relapses came in cycles, unpredictable and cruel. And though Sharon remained his anchor, there were times he slipped beneath the surface without her knowing. Or worse, without her wanting to know. There's a certain danger in loving someone you have to rescue over and over again. You start to lose track of where your needs begin and theirs end. You become so accustomed to the role of savior, you forget you're also human, that you also bleed. Sharon didn't just manage Ozzy's chaos. She absorbed it. And somewhere along the way, her own pain went unnoticed, even by herself. The world celebrated them as a power couple. But power, in their case, came at a high price. Behind the scenes, Sharon was constantly juggling, parenting teenagers while negotiating contracts, defending her marriage while silencing whispers about infidelity. She brushed off the rumors. She laughed them away on talk shows. Ozzy's always been wild, she'd say, but he always comes home. She said it so often, she started to believe it. Until one day, he didn't come home emotionally. He stayed with someone else. Someone they trusted. Someone Sharon had hired. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had defended him against every scandal, every tabloid, every whisper, had failed to protect herself from the most intimate betrayal of all. Their love story, once romanticized for its chaos, was now buckling under the very weight of that chaos. The Osbournes were never a traditional family. They didn't play by conventional rules. And maybe that's why it took Sharon so long to recognize that the boundaries had been crossed, not just by Ozzy, but by herself. She had allowed the rules to bend too far. She had convinced herself that love was meant to hurt sometimes. That suffering was part of the deal. But betrayal doesn't follow the rules of resilience. It doesn't care how many years you've endured. It doesn't care how many concerts you've survived, how many family dinners you've organized, or how many public statements you've crafted. It just breaks you. Quietly, from the inside out. Looking back now, Sharon doesn't deny that there was love, deep, fiery love. She doesn't regret the years they spent together, the children they raised, or the empire they built. But she also doesn't romanticize it anymore. Because love that demands silence in the face of betrayal isn't love, it's survival. And Sharon Osbourne, at 72, is done just surviving. She's speaking now, not to destroy Ozzy or their history, but to reclaim her place in it. To finally tell her side, the one that was always buried under PR strategies, and public loyalty. Theirs was a love forged in chaos. But even fire can go cold. It started, as most betrayals do, with trust. Not the obvious kind that gets handed out lightly, but the deep, personal trust that builds in silence, through routine and repetition over time. The kind of trust that feels so natural, so safe, you forget how dangerous it can be. That's what Sharon Osbourne handed over the day she hired the nanny. Not just a job, but access. To her children, to her home, to her husband. The Osbourne household was never quiet, never ordinary. Fame had turned their private lives into public fodder, their eccentricities into entertainment. Between tour schedules, reality TV filming, managing Ozzy's career, and raising 3 strong-willed children, Sharon needed help. Real help. Not someone who clocked in and out, but someone who could become an extension of the family. A constant in the chaos. So the nanny came. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't flashy. She came with solid references, a warm smile, and a presence that felt calm, perhaps too calm for a house like the Osbournes. She was young, attractive, and always pleasant. At first, Sharon felt lucky to have found someone so seemingly grounded. She was good with the kids, dependable with the routine, and respectful of boundaries. Or so it seemed. It wasn't long before the nanny became more than just staff. Sharon, juggling 3 different crises on any given day, leaned on her more and more. She was present during school pickups, holiday gatherings, backstage at shows, even seated at the family dinner table. It was all so gradual, so subtle, that no alarm bells rang. The Osbournes were never a traditional family, and Sharon never clung to traditional class lines. To her, loyalty mattered more than hierarchy. If someone proved themselves trustworthy, they were family. And the nanny had proven herself, or so Sharon thought. But trust has a way of clouding judgment. Familiarity, when unchecked, can breed entitlement. The boundary between professional and personal began to blur. Ozzy would chat with her longer in the kitchen after meals. He'd ask for her help with little things Sharon thought odd. Picking out outfits, finding his glasses, even fetching his medications. Small things, individually meaningless. But added together, they created a quiet intimacy. A closeness that Sharon noticed, but didn't immediately fear. After all, she'd known Ozzy for decades. She had seen him spiral into addiction and claw his way back. She had weathered his unpredictability, his darkness, his genius. She had believed, perhaps naively, that they had passed the stage of temptations. That what they had was too old, too real, to be touched by something so base. But love doesn't immunize you from betrayal. In fact, it sometimes blinds you to its earliest signs. There were moments, now seared into Sharon's memory, that should have warned her. Times when she'd walk into a room and the two of them, Ozzy and the nanny, would fall abruptly silent. Glances exchanged that lingered a moment too long. Excuses that didn't quite add up. Laughter that seemed to carry a secret code. But Sharon pushed the doubt aside. She had bigger battles to fight. Ozzy's health, her own bouts with cancer, business deals, media appearances, and, more than anything, holding the family together. Doubt, after all, is a luxury for people who aren't already stretched thin. At one point, the nanny began spending more time at the estate than even Sharon. She was there during tours, while Sharon accompanied Ozzy or handled logistics. She stayed overnight during family vacations when Sharon needed to fly ahead for work. Sharon even confided in her, trusted her with details of their schedules, with insights into the children's needs, with information about Ozzy's state of mind. In a twisted way, the nanny became Sharon's confidant. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest irony of all. Because behind the facade of support, something else was growing. Something secret, corrosive, and devastating. While Sharon was leaning on her, the nanny was leaning in, into the cracks of a fragile marriage, into the spaces where trust once lived, into the silence Sharon had grown accustomed to. Ozzy, for all his flaws, was never good at hiding things. His addictions always revealed themselves eventually. His emotions, raw and unfiltered, never stayed buried for long. But this time was different. He became distant, yes, but also oddly comfortable. His guilt, if he felt any, was buried under years of practiced excuses and a persona that blurred lines between chaos and calculated rebellion. Sharon remembered a particular evening. They were hosting friends for dinner. The nanny was supposed to be off duty, yet she lingered. She poured Ozzy's wine without being asked. She laughed at his jokes louder than usual. She sat too close. Sharon noticed, and for the first time, she felt the burn of suspicion rise in her chest. She confronted Ozzy afterward. He dismissed it, said she was overreacting, that she was jealous, that she was tired. And Sharon, conditioned to carry the weight of keeping everything in control, chose not to fight. Not yet. Because sometimes the truth isn't something you search for. Sometimes you wait for it to reveal itself. And it always does. Eventually. In retrospect, Sharon said it wasn't just the betrayal that crushed her. It was how easily it unfolded under her roof. How the woman she trusted, the one she had welcomed into her most sacred spaces, had taken advantage of that trust. How Ozzy, after all they had survived together, had allowed it to happen, not in some seedy hotel or hidden apartment, but in their home, in their bed. The signs were all there, Sharon would later admit. But life moves fast when you're constantly reacting. When you're the fixer, the manager, the matriarch, you don't always have the luxury of stopping to assess. You just keep going until something breaks. And something did. This chapter of Sharon's story isn't just about a nanny. It's about what happens when the roles we play, wife, mother, manager, consume us so completely that we forget to protect ourselves. It's about the slow erosion of boundaries, the danger of assuming loyalty, and the heartbreak of realizing the person you trusted most, and the person you trusted beside them, chose silence over respect. The woman in the house had become a threat long before Sharon realized it. But once she did, there would be no going back. The damage was done. Some moments in life carve themselves so deeply into your memory that no amount of time, healing, or forgiveness can fade them. For Sharon Osbourne, that moment came on an otherwise unremarkable night. There were no paparazzi flashing outside the gates, no scandal brewing on the internet, no public chaos to signal the storm that was about to descend. It was quiet, still, but that silence was a lie, and Sharon's world was about to be broken in a way she hadn't anticipated, in a place she had thought was sacred. It had been a long day. Sharon had just returned from a press event and charity dinner in central London. Her schedule had been grueling, filled with camera lights, makeup touch-ups, rehearsed smiles, and relentless questions about Ozzy's recovery from his recent health flare-up. The world wanted to know everything, about his tour, about his state of mind, about their marriage. But Sharon had perfected the art of saying a lot without revealing anything. She'd been doing it for decades. When she arrived home that night, it was already close to midnight. The manor was dimly lit, the kind of eerie stillness that creeps into large homes when everyone has supposedly gone to bed. She kicked off her heels near the door and set down her bag, grateful for the peace, looking forward to unwinding in solitude. She made her way to the kitchen to pour a glass of wine. The house was quiet, but not in the usual peaceful way. It felt vacant, as though something or someone was missing, or worse, hiding, as she walked through the corridor toward her bedroom. The one she and Ozzy had shared for most of their married life. Something felt off. A light she hadn't left on. A faint sound that didn't belong. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe one of the kids had come by. Maybe the housekeeper had left something on. Maybe Ozzy was still up, watching TV. But as she approached the bedroom, the feeling intensified. There was a warmth behind the door, the glow of the bedside lamp seeping out just slightly from the cracked frame. Her hand reached out instinctively, pushing it open, and there they were. Ozzy, the nanny, in bed, together. The image would stay with her like a tattoo burned into her brain. Ozzy half-dressed, caught in a moment of stunned panic. The nanny clutching a sheet, frozen in fear. Both looking up at Sharon with expressions that mixed guilt, terror, and the horrifying realization that their secret was no longer a secret. Sharon didn't scream. She didn't faint. She didn't throw anything. She just stood there, eyes wide, shoulders stiff, her soul falling through the floor. The silence in that room was deafening. It wasn't just what she saw. It was everything it symbolized. The betrayal wasn't simply a physical one. It was emotional, psychological, spiritual. This was their bedroom, the sanctuary she had shared with her husband through decades of storms. The place where she had comforted him through withdrawals, celebrated holidays, made plans for their future. Now, that sacred space had been defiled in the most personal and intimate way possible. In the span of seconds, Memories flooded her mind. All the time she had defended Ozzy to the press, to friends, to herself. All the sacrifices she had made to protect their marriage, to keep their family together. And now this, not even the decency to hide it. He had brought the betrayal into their bed. Sharon turned and walked away. Not a word, not a sound. Her legs moved on instinct, but her mind was frozen. The hallway, once so familiar, now stretched endlessly in front of her like a tunnel of disbelief. She ended up in the guest bedroom and locked the door behind her. Only then did the tears come. Not loud, not theatrical, just quiet sobs, the kind that come from the deepest recesses of the heart, where anger hasn't yet formed because the pain is too fresh. That night, she didn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the scene over and over, each loop slicing deeper into her chest. She tried to convince herself that she had misinterpreted what she saw, that there had to be an explanation. But the truth was undeniable. She had seen it with her own eyes. There was no spinning it, no excuse, no saving grace. In the morning, the house was awkwardly quiet. No one dared to speak. The nanny had disappeared, her belongings gone, her bedroom emptied, as if she had never been there. Ozzy was nowhere to be seen either. And Sharon? She sat in the kitchen, staring into her tea like it held answers she couldn't reach. When Ozzy finally emerged, he didn't deny it. He didn't offer a carefully crafted excuse. Instead, he stood in front of her like a man who knew the world he had built was about to collapse. Sharon didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply asked him, "How long?" He hesitated. Then he said it. "A few years. A few years. Not a fling. Not a mistake. A long-term, deliberate betrayal. Sustained, nurtured, hidden in plain sight." Sharon's body went numb. The betrayal was deeper than she thought. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a second life that he had been living under her roof, during holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, pretending nothing was wrong. She had questions, but they all felt useless. Why her? How often? Did the children know? The details wouldn't change the outcome. The damage was done, and it went deeper than sex. It was about trust, about safety, about the illusion that the chaos they had built their lives around was under control. It wasn't. Sharon spent the following days in a state of emotional limbo. Her mind flipped between heartbreak and logistics. Could she leave? Would she survive the media firestorm? Would the kids blame her? What would happen to their business, their image, their empire? Because betrayal, when it happens in a public marriage, isn't just personal, it's political. There's branding to consider. Endorsements, contracts, public opinion. Sharon wasn't just a wife. She was a brand. And Ozzy wasn't just a husband. He was a global icon. If she walked away, everything would collapse. So she stayed. Not because she forgave. Not because she was weak. But because she didn't yet know how to leave without destroying everything else. She told no one. Not Kelly. Not Jack. Not her friends. She buried the secret and wore her silence like armor. The world kept spinning. They kept up appearances. And only Sharon knew the truth that was eating her alive. That night, the night it all unraveled, marked the beginning of the end, even if the world wouldn't know for years. From that moment forward, everything changed. The way she looked at Ozzy, the way she moved through the house, the way she spoke in interviews. A shift had taken place, and though she tried to maintain the illusion, it was impossible to unsee what she had seen. The betrayal was no longer just a wound. It became a lens through which she saw everything else. And though it would take time, years, in fact, Sharon would eventually find her voice again. But not before facing the darkest parts of herself, her marriage, and the truth she could no longer hide. The morning after that life-altering moment didn't come with the thunder of a confrontation or the explosion of a public breakup. There were no police cars, no suitcases tossed on the lawn, no dramatic exits. Instead, there was quiet, haunting quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace, but the sharp sting of realization. Life would never be the same again. And yet, despite the devastation still crackling in the air around her, Sharon Osbourne did what millions of women before her have done when betrayal takes up residence in their homes. She got up, made breakfast, and pretended nothing had changed. Pretending became her new job. The public had no idea what had unfolded behind the grand iron gates of the Osbourne estate. Sharon didn't call the tabloids. She didn't cancel her appearances. She didn't even allow a pause in her carefully managed routine. The family brand had been built on chaos. Yes, but a controlled chaos, the kind that entertains rather than dismantles. A scandal like this would go beyond entertainment. It would destroy everything they had spent decades constructing. She told no one. Not her co-hosts at the talk. Not her friends in the industry. Not even her children. If they suspected something, they never said it aloud, at least not at first. And Sharon didn't offer anything to confirm their worst fears. She was too busy crafting the image, smiling for the cameras, showing up for work, supporting Ozzy publicly, even as he became a stranger to her privately. Behind the scenes, the damage was seismic. She and Ozzy were barely speaking. When they did, the words were clipped, mechanical, devoid of tenderness. He apologized, yes, but it was the kind of apology that came after years of decay, too little and far too late. He blamed his addictions, his confusion, the pressure of fame. He said he had made a terrible mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, and Sharon knew that. Still, she stayed, because the stakes were higher than love. There were contracts, endorsements, projects, employees, tour crews. There were their children, both grown and still emotionally tethered to the legacy their parents had created. And above all else, there was the image, the idea that, no matter how messy they were, the Osbournes were unbreakable. But Sharon knew the truth. They were already broken. The only question now was whether they could survive the illusion they'd created. So she buried herself in work. She focused on Kelly's career, on Jack's sobriety, on her own public persona. The more she poured herself into distractions, the easier it became to numb the pain, to compartmentalize the betrayal into something manageable. But nothing numbs forever. The cracks always show. She started noticing things about herself. She didn't sleep as deeply. She avoided certain rooms in the house, especially their bedroom, which now felt haunted. She rehearsed conversations in her mind that she would never actually have. She smiled for cameras and died inside when the flashbulbs faded. And worst of all, she began to question everything she had ever believed about her marriage. Had she missed the signs all along? Had there been others before the nanny? Was the love they had built truly real? Or had she simply been fooling herself because it was easier than facing the truth? These weren't just painful thoughts. They were corrosive. They began to eat away at her identity, her sense of self-worth. For a woman who had always been the strongest in the room, the fixer, the protector, the boss, this new role of silent sufferer was unbearable. And yet, she played it well. In interviews, she would speak fondly of Ozzy, talk about their love, joke about his eccentricities. She even continued to accompany him on tours and public appearances. Together, they posed as the same wild, unconventional couple the world had come to adore. And behind every grin, every compliment, every loving hand on his arm, was a secret so heavy it bent her spine. There were nights when she'd sit alone, staring at the old photos of their wedding, their early days, the chaotic years of raising 3 children. She'd whisper to the images, "Why wasn't that enough for you?" But photos don't answer. They only reflect. The lie was both personal and professional. She wasn't just covering for a cheating husband. She was upholding a narrative the world wanted to believe. Because if even Sharon and Ozzy could fall apart, what hope was there for the rest of us? They had become cultural symbols of imperfect but enduring love. Destroying that image would shatter more than a marriage. It would dismantle a myth. So she continued to wear the mask. Even in her silence, Sharon had moments of strength. She negotiated deals, advocated for her children, launched projects. She didn't crawl into bed and stay there. She didn't self-destruct. But that didn't mean she wasn't breaking. The wounds were just hidden behind designer sunglasses and red carpet gowns. The pain showed up in other ways. Shorter temper, distance from friends, over-control in areas where she once trusted others. She became more protective of her time, her space, her peace. Because if she couldn't protect her heart, at least she could protect what was left of her dignity. People who saw her during those years often said she seemed stronger than ever. They mistook silence for strength, professionalism for peace. But the truth was far more tragic. Sharon Osbourne was surviving on the fumes of a marriage that had already died. And no one knew. She often wondered what would happen if the truth came out. Would people judge her for staying? Would they call her weak, hypocritical, complicit? Would they question everything she stood for? Or would they understand? that sometimes the hardest thing to do isn't walking away, but staying when everything inside you wants to run? It wasn't just love that kept her there. It was history, legacy, control, fear, and maybe, deep down, it was hope. Hope that he would change, that he would fight for her the way she had fought for him, that something in him would finally realize the depth of what he had nearly destroyed. But days turned into months, and months into years, and the silence between them grew louder than the screaming ever had. They shared spaces, meals, interviews, but not intimacy, not truth. For a long time, Sharon convinced herself that silence was a form of survival, that the lie they lived was better than the truth they would have to face. But survival, without healing, is just a slow erosion. And eventually, something would have to give. There's a particular cruelty in living two lives at once, one for the cameras and one behind closed doors. Sharon Osbourne knew that pain all too well. In public, she played the role flawlessly, the loving wife, the quick-witted commentator, the rock and roll matriarch who had seen it all and still smiled through the storm. But in private, she was a woman unraveling. And the contrast between those two worlds, the polished veneer and the hidden agony, became harder and harder to sustain. Sharon had always been sharp, both in business and in personality. Her candor, her bite, her confidence were admired and feared in equal measure. She had carved out a career for herself not just as Ozzy's wife and manager, but as a formidable voice in her own right. Her time on The Talk and other programs showcased her as someone who didn't shy away from uncomfortable truths. Ironically, the one truth she could never say aloud was the one that had left the deepest wound. The media continued to ask about their marriage, sometimes playfully, sometimes invasively. Reporters would drop questions like, "What's your secret to staying together after all these years?" Or, "Is it true Ozzy still drives you mad in the best ways?" Sharon had mastered her answers. She'd laugh, throw in a self-deprecating joke, and pivot to safer ground. And no one ever questioned it. They believed the act because she performed it so well. There were photos of them on red carpets, arm in arm. Social media posts featuring anniversary wishes and behind-the-scenes glimpses of family moments. And from the outside, it looked like the Osbournes were the ultimate survivors. People admired their ability to stay married through so much addiction, fame, madness. But those very people didn't realize that one of the greatest trials had never even been publicly acknowledged. Behind the scenes, Sharon was holding it all together with threads. Ozzy, though remorseful in moments, continued to live in his own erratic rhythm. He could be loving and thoughtful one day, detached and unreachable the next. His health issues, his battles with Parkinson's, and his fragility made things even more complicated. Sharon became both caregiver and betrayed spouse, a dynamic that added layers of guilt, frustration, and emotional contradiction. How do you hate someone you also feel responsible for? How do you grieve a relationship that technically still exists? How do you walk into a studio, face an audience, and smile, knowing your private life is burning behind you? Sharon found the answer in compartmentalization. She split herself into versions. The professional Sharon, who booked deals, gave interviews, and guided careers. The mother Sharon, who protected her children from the darker realities of her marriage. And the private Sharon, who cried in the car on the way home, who avoided mirrors because they reflected a woman she didn't recognize anymore. She didn't tell many people the truth, but those closest to her noticed the change. Her longtime assistants, her stylists, her friends who had weathered decades with her, they saw the weariness in her eyes. The way her jokes turned more bitter. The way she seemed to disappear into her work like a soldier returning to the trenches. They asked questions, softly, respectfully. She brushed them off with a smile. Always the smile. She feared that telling the truth would make her look like a fool. That after years of defending Ozzy, of vouching for their love, admitting the betrayal would unravel everything she had said, everything she had stood for. But deeper than that was the fear that if she said the words out loud, they would become real in a way she couldn't take back. Even on The Talk, a show built on sharing opinions and being vulnerable, she kept the truth close to her chest. She weighed every word before it left her mouth. When conversations turned to cheating, she'd speak in generalities. When co-hosts asked about forgiveness, she'd offer diplomatic wisdom. But her eyes, those betrayed her. If anyone had looked closely enough, they would have seen the flicker of pain, the pause between words, the moment she swallowed back something too heavy to share. Her private hell didn't come with screaming matches or broken plates. It came in the form of cold dinners shared across a long table. It came in the quiet footsteps of Ozzy walking past her without speaking. It came in the way her own home started to feel like a museum of false memories, photographs that smiled back at her with hollow eyes. Every corner of the house held a memory that now felt like a lie. The kitchen, where she and Ozzy used to dance during late-night snacks. The den, where they laughed with the kids while watching horror movies. The garden, where he once surprised her with a vow renewal. All of it was tainted now. Not ruined entirely, but changed. And Sharon had to pretend that the change hadn't happened. There were moments when she thought about leaving. Not just the marriage, but everything. Selling the house. Vanishing from the public eye. Starting over in a small cottage somewhere far from the flashbulbs and expectations. But Sharon had never been one to run. She had been raised to fight, to endure. And even now, with her heart shattered and her dignity bruised, she couldn't imagine abandoning the life she had built. So she stayed. And every day, she put on the costume of Sharon Osbourne. The firebrand, the icon, the iron woman who could survive anything. But survival comes at a cost. And for Sharon, that cost was authenticity. She lost touch with herself in small, imperceptible ways. Her laughter became more mechanical. Her fashion more calculated. Her interviews more scripted. The woman who had once thrived on being bold and unscripted was now walking through life like a ghost of herself. And yet, through all of it, the public never knew. Because the show had to go on. The business had to continue. The fans had to be entertained. And Sharon, ever the professional, knew how to deliver. Looking back, she would later admit that those years were the hardest of her life. Not because of the betrayal itself, but because of the silence that followed. Because every day that passed without speaking the truth felt like a betrayal of herself. And the more she lied to the world, the more she began to disappear inside. For all the pain Sharon Osbourne endured in private, nothing pierced her deeper than the thought of how it might affect her children. The betrayal she experienced wasn't an isolated wound. It was a fracture that ran through the very foundation of her family. And though she had done everything in her power to shield them from the fallout, she knew that when two people live a lie under the same roof, the children feel the tremors even if no one says a word. Amy, Kelly, and Jack, each uniquely forged by their upbringing, each carrying their own piece of the Osbourne legacy, were no strangers to dysfunction. They had grown up in a house filled with loud music, louder arguments, and the quiet, unsettling calm that often followed a storm. They had seen their father high and incoherent, their mother furious and exhausted. They had seen cameras turn their chaos into television and strangers comment on their most private moments. But what they hadn't seen, or so Sharon hoped, was the moment their family cracked beyond repair. When Sharon first discovered Ozzy's affair with the nanny, her instinct wasn't to rage or punish. It was to protect. Not herself, not Ozzy, but her children. The idea that they might see their family as fractured, as weak, as something that could be destroyed from within, it was unthinkable to her. She had worked so hard to hold everything together for them, to give them stability, even if it was unconventional, to create a sense of love and unity, even when the world saw only chaos. And now that illusion was threatened, Jack had always been the sensitive one. Deep-thinking, kind-hearted, and surprisingly grounded despite the world he was raised in. He had battled his own demons, addiction, depression, and Sharon had been there every step of the way. She knew how fragile his recovery had been, how much he needed a sense of normalcy and trust. Telling him what had happened with Ozzy would crush him. It would feel like a betrayal on a cosmic level. The father he had fought so hard to understand, now revealed to have committed the ultimate betrayal. Kelly, on the other hand, was fire. She wore her emotions on her sleeve, and her loyalty to her mother was unmatched. If she knew the truth, she would explode. Not just at Ozzy, but at the world. Sharon worried that revealing the affair would send Kelly into a spiral, emotionally, publicly, professionally. She feared her daughter would become reckless, hurt herself or others, or burn bridges she couldn't rebuild. And Amy, the most private of the three, had always stayed out of the spotlight. She valued peace, distance, and control. She had chosen not to be part of the reality show, not to engage in the family brand. Sharon respected that, and she knew that dragging Amy into the mess of this betrayal would feel like a violation. So Sharon said nothing. She continued to host family dinners. She called her children daily. She attended their premieres, helped with their projects, and offered advice as if nothing had changed. When they came over, she smiled. When they left, she wept in silence. But children, no matter how old, always sense when something is wrong with their mother. And Sharon was not good at hiding it forever. One evening, during a family gathering, Jack pulled her aside. His voice was quiet, his eyes full of concern. He didn't ask directly. Instead, he said something that broke her heart. "Are you okay, Mom? You don't seem like yourself." She wanted to break down right then, to collapse into his arms and finally let it out. But she didn't. She smiled, squeezed his hand, and said, "I'm just tired, darling. That's all." It was the truth, but not all of it. Kelly, too, began to notice. Her mother's sharp wit dulled slightly. Her energy felt thinner, more forced. She asked fewer questions, gave shorter answers. Kelly tried to compensate by being more upbeat, more present, but the tension lingered. It clung to the corners of the room like fog that wouldn't lift. Eventually, the truth would start to leak, not from Sharon, but from the world. Ozzy's behavior grew increasingly erratic. There were whispers in the industry, rumors, tabloid snippets hinting at inappropriate relationships. The press was circling, and Sharon knew that it was only a matter of time before her children heard something they couldn't unhear. So she sat them down, not all at once, separately, carefully. She didn't go into detail. She didn't name names. But she told them enough to make them understand. Their father had made choices that deeply hurt her, that their marriage was no longer what it once was, that she was doing everything she could to move forward with grace. The reactions were varied: heartbreak, anger, disbelief. Jack cried. He said he'd always suspected something wasn't right, but had hoped it wasn't true. Kelly was furious. She called Ozzy a coward, said she would never forgive him. Then she hugged her mother tighter than ever before. Amy was quiet. She listened. She nodded. She offered her mother a simple, powerful phrase. "You don't have to protect us anymore." That was the moment Sharon realized how long she had been carrying a burden that didn't belong to her alone. The betrayal had hurt her deeply, yes. But what had nearly destroyed her was the effort to pretend it hadn't happened, to keep her children safe from something they had already felt in their bones. Once the truth was spoken, something shifted. A small crack of light pierced the darkness. Conversations became more honest. There were still wounds, still awkwardness, still moments of pain, but there was also freedom. Sharon no longer had to lie. She no longer had to smile through every event, every holiday, every interview as though nothing had happened. She could be real again, not just for herself, but for her children. Over time, they grew closer. They talked more openly. They stood by her, publicly and privately. And though their relationship with Ozzy would remain complicated, Sharon made one thing clear. They could love their father and still hold him accountable. They could be a family and still acknowledge the fracture. Sharon once believed that keeping up appearances was the way to protect her children. But what she learned, painfully, slowly, was that honesty, even when messy, is the only real protection. Because the lie she lived wasn't just hurting her. It was hurting them too. Forgiveness. It's a word people like to toss around when they hear stories of betrayal, heartbreak, or loss. It sounds noble, clean, redemptive, the kind of word you put on a greeting card or in a self-help book. But for Sharon Osbourne, forgiveness wasn't a light switch she could flip. It wasn't a moral badge to wear proudly. It was a battle, quiet, internal, and relentless. And in the end, it didn't bring healing. At least, not in the way she had once hoped. After the initial storm, the night she caught Ozzy in bed with their nanny, the silent days that followed, the confrontation over just how long the affair had lasted, Sharon found herself in unfamiliar emotional territory. She wasn't screaming or throwing things. She wasn't packing a bag or booking a hotel room. She was stuck in a strange limbo, unsure what to do next. Leaving was an option. She had the financial power, the independence, and, frankly, the moral high ground. But walking away would mean more than just exiting a marriage. It would mean stepping out of the very identity she had built over decades, not just as Sharon, but as Ozzy and Sharon. A team, a brand, a mythology. So instead of running, she did what she'd been conditioned to do all her life. She stayed. And she tried to forgive. At first, forgiveness seemed like a decision, a mental checkbox she could mark to move on. She told herself it was for her own peace, not his. That she couldn't carry the weight of resentment forever. That forgiveness wasn't a gift to Ozzy, but a reclaiming of her own power. But forgiveness, as she soon discovered, isn't a decision. It's a process, and one that, in her case, led to more questions than answers. What did it mean to forgive a man who had not only betrayed her, but done so in the heart of their home? What did it mean to forgive someone who had watched her unravel and still said, "I didn't mean to hurt you"? What did it mean to forgive when the betrayal was deliberate, sustained, and hidden behind her back for years? Ozzy apologized. He wept. He admitted to the affair. Eventually, he admitted to more than one. It was a pattern, a failing he tied to his addiction, his self-destructive nature, his inability to cope with fame and aging. He said all the right things, in all the right tones. And still, Sharon found herself unable to feel peace. Because apologies aren't antidotes. They don't undo the nights she lay awake wondering what was real. They don't erase the sound of the nanny's laugh echoing down the hallway when she was supposed to be part of their trusted circle. They don't repair the loss of security, the corrosion of respect. Forgiveness became a burden all its own. People expected her to rise above it, to find grace in the aftermath, to prove her strength through letting go. But every time someone said, "You're such a strong woman for forgiving him," it felt like another layer of pressure, another expectation to live up to. What people didn't see were the nights when Sharon sat alone in the garden, glass of wine in hand, wondering if she was a fool. They didn't see the way she flinched when Ozzy touched her shoulder unexpectedly. They didn't know how long it took for her to sleep in the master bedroom again, or how many nights she still avoided it altogether. There were times she thought she had moved past it. Times when Ozzy was sweet, present, apologetic. They went on trips together. They appeared at public events. They even laughed again. But the laughter had changed. It was lighter on the surface, but heavier underneath. As if both of them were pretending not to remember what had happened, even as it hung in the air between every word, every glance. And then there were the setbacks, relapses, late nights, suspicious silences. Sharon never found concrete proof of another affair after the nanny, but suspicion had rooted itself inside her. It grew in silence. It fed on doubt, and it stole her ability to ever fully relax in his presence again. She wanted to forgive. Truly, she did. Not for appearances, not for the brand, but for herself. Because she knew that holding on to rage would only harden her, isolate her, diminish her. And yet, every attempt at forgiveness felt hollow, like she was performing an act rather than experiencing a transformation. Eventually, Sharon began to understand that forgiveness wasn't the same as healing. You could forgive someone and still carry the wound. You could say the words and still feel the pain. You could move forward and still feel stuck. There were days when she looked at Ozzy and saw the man she had fallen in love with, the wild, beautiful soul who had shown her both the ecstasy and the agony of unconditional love. And there were days when she looked at him and felt nothing but coldness, not hate, not even anger, just numbness. That numbness scared her the most, because at least with anger, there was still feeling, still investment, still a tether to what had been. But numbness? That was the beginning of indifference. And Sharon had never been indifferent to Ozzy, not for 1 second of their chaotic, combustible life together. So she tried to reconnect. They went to counseling. They read books. They watched old videos of their family, trying to recapture the magic. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it felt like a cruel joke, like she was clinging to ghosts. She once told a close friend, in a rare moment of raw vulnerability, "I forgave him, but I don't know if I'll ever trust him again." And without trust, what are we? That question haunted her. The world often frames forgiveness as a destination, a place you arrive at, like the peak of a mountain after a long climb. But Sharon came to see it differently. For her, forgiveness was a river she waded into daily. Some days it was calm. Some days it tried to drown her. And some days, she stood on the shore, too tired to even step in. She never made a grand declaration of having forgiven Ozzy. No headlines. No press releases. Just quiet, personal choices. Choosing to stay when she could have left. Choosing to speak kindly when bitterness would have been easier. choosing to keep showing up, not because she had to, but because she wasn't ready to give up entirely. But none of those choices erased the damage. None of them rebuilt the trust. And Sharon, wise enough to know her own heart, didn't pretend they did. Because sometimes, forgiveness doesn't lead to healing. Sometimes it leads to distance, to boundaries, to an acceptance that the love you have isn't the love you once had and may never be again. And still, she stayed. Not as a woman defeated, but as a woman in transition. From betrayal to clarity. From silence to truth. From survival to self-respect. For weeks after Sharon discovered Ozzy's long-term affair with the nanny, the walls between them were thick and cold. Conversation was minimal. Eye contact avoided. They lived in the same house, but in different emotional galaxies. And then, one morning, the silence broke. Ozzy walked into the kitchen with a look on his face Sharon had seen before, a mix of shame, desperation, and that hollow, confused panic that often followed his worst mistakes. He didn't sit. He stood there, fidgeting, unable to look her in the eye. "I'm sorry," he said, voice dry, strained. "I don't know why I did it." Sharon didn't move. She stared at him, face unreadable, and said nothing. The apology was overdue. It should have come the night she caught him. It should have come before she had to ask him how long it had been going on. It should have been something more than a sentence. But here it was, and it floated in the air like a paper airplane with nowhere to land. Ozzy had never been great at apologies. His life had been one long pendulum swing between excess and remorse. Sharon had seen him beg producers for second chances. She'd heard him slur tearful apologies to their children during his darkest hours. She'd watched him cry over broken promises and then break them again days later. This was different. This was not about substances or fame or the pressures of touring. This was about a choice, a secret, a betrayal he nurtured in the very space where Sharon thought she was safest. And now he was saying sorry. But the words felt empty, because an apology is only as valuable as the change that follows it. And in Ozzy's case, change came in fits and starts, if it came at all. He admitted to the affair. Eventually, he admitted there had been others before the nanny. Groupies. Fling-type encounters he never spoke about, conveniently blaming his blackout states and the crazy years. He tried to rationalize it as the consequence of addiction, as if his compulsions absolved him from responsibility. Sharon listened, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. For closure. For the truth. But every new admission chipped away at the version of their life she had built. It was one thing to suspect, another to know. He apologized again and again. Some days he'd bring her tea. Other days he'd write her letters, long, scribbled notes filled with apologies and promises and declarations of love. He told her she was the only woman he ever truly loved. That what he did meant nothing. That he hated himself for it. But for Sharon, the damage wasn't about meaning. It wasn't about whether he loved the other women. It was about the lies, the secrecy, the way he allowed another person into the heart of their marriage and then pretended like nothing had happened. She would later say, "It wasn't just the betrayal that broke me. It was how easy it was for him to go back to normal while I was still drowning in it." They tried counseling. A therapist familiar with high-profile relationships and the unique strain fame puts on them. Sharon sat stiffly in those sessions, her arms folded, her heart guarded. Ozzy was more emotional, sometimes weeping, sometimes deflecting with humor. He was a man who had made peace with his chaos. Sharon, on the other hand, was still trying to put names to the pain. The therapist encouraged honesty. Sharon asked questions. Ozzy answered some, dodged others. Sometimes his memory was foggy, other times too sharp. The more details she learned, the more the emotional bruises turned to scars. At home, things were civil. Too civil. They shared meals, occasionally watched shows together, exchanged polite conversation. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer husband and wife in the truest sense. They were business partners cohabiting. Two weary souls orbiting the same silence. The apologies continued. They came in gifts, in songs, in sudden embraces. Sometimes Ozzy would look at her with eyes so sad, she thought he might collapse under their weight. But then he'd change the subject, crack a joke, or disappear into his music room. And always, Sharon remained caught between exhaustion and compassion. She remembered the good times. The early days, the chaos that felt romantic instead of tragic. She remembered the man who held her hand through cancer treatments. The father who doted on Kelly and Jack when he was sober. The partner who once told her she was the only reason he hadn't given up on himself. But memories aren't enough when trust is gone. And trust wasn't something Ozzy could rebuild with apologies alone. There were nights when Sharon would sit up in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was it. If this was the new normal, polite distance, occasional warmth, but no true intimacy. She missed the way things used to be, even if those days were never perfect. She missed the belief that no matter how messy they were in it together. Now she felt alone. Even when Ozzy was in the room, she felt alone. His apologies, however sincere, couldn't fix that. Because words can't unring a bell. They can't erase the image of betrayal. They can't undo the way your heart skips when your partner walks in the room and you wonder where they've been. Sharon knew Ozzy loved her in his own way. But love, without respect and truth, wasn't enough anymore. So she started pulling back. Quietly. She created more space for herself. More time with friends. More energy for her own projects. She stopped asking Ozzy where he was going. She stopped checking on him. She stopped looking for proof of loyalty because she no longer believed it would come. And that, perhaps, was the most painful part. She had forgiven him. Or tried to. But she no longer trusted him. And with that realization came the slow, inevitable truth. Forgiveness doesn't always bring closeness. Sometimes it just allows you to move forward, but separately.